Hi guys, Brett Manning here, trustee of the new Aussie Constitution Trust. The new Aussie Constitution is a proposed replacement for the current Australian Constitution that has been developed outside of government and outside of political parties. Now if you follow this channel you'll know that I've been quiet since the election and haven't had too much to say, and that's because I've been waiting to see how the new government propose to handle the first of the constitutional changes that they are proposing, and this is the introduction of an indigenous voice to Parliament. So the Prime Minister has recently given a speech, and at that speech he outlined the proposed changes to the Constitution, and obviously any change to the Constitution requires a referendum. And the question that they're proposing to use is, do you support an alteration of the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? Good simple question, and one that I think would get a lot of support in Australia and would probably pass. Certainly the new Aussie Constitution includes an Indigenous voice to Parliament, and so I would be supportive of these changes. But the only guidance that we're given as to what that answering yes to that question would mean is that the Prime Minister has suggested that there would be 3 sentences added to the Constitution, and they are: there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have the power to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So it doesn't sound like there's anything too difficult in that. It sounds fairly straightforward. But I have some significant concerns with this sort of approach to constitutional change. The Constitution exists to determine how our government will operate. It doesn't exist to make decisions from day to day. That's the job of the government and the Parliament. Now it is designed to establish our system of government, and it's deliberately set up so that the government of the day can't make changes to that system. So here we're making a change to the Constitution. However, the change to the Constitution says that the Parliament shall make the laws as to how the Indigenous voice to Parliament will work. So this is problematic. The issue here is that we're giving a partisan voice to how the government will operate, Australian government will operate. So just based on these words here, the Parliament would have the powers to make laws in respect to the composition, function, powers and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Now, that could mean anything with any future government, whether it be a left-wing government or a right-wing government. If it were a left-wing government, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice could be made up of 1,000 elected officials with a separate parliament, and despite the fact that the Prime Minister says that this isn't about giving Indigenous people a right of veto over Australian legislation, potentially the government could make that a law. It has the power to do that. And equally, if a far right-wing government were to come into power, they could decide that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice consists of 2 white fellas, or even monarchist government could suggest that those 2 people be selected by the Queen. So that you're on a real slippery slope when you start giving the Parliament, which is designed to be a combative environment of ideas, but ultimately it's partisan, and that means the government that's in power at the time can skew this legislation the way it suits them. So it's inappropriate for the actual system of government to be within control of the Parliament. And what worries me even more about this is that if this approach were adopted in the second term of the current government, where they propose to suggest Australia become a republic, if they took this same approach there and said, oh, the question is, do you think Australia should be a republic? And if you answer yes, we'll add a couple of sentences into the Constitution that says Australia is a republic and the systems of how that will operate will be determined by the Parliament. And all of a sudden we're in exactly the same boat. The Parliament should not decide how the country operates, under no circumstances. With the new Aussie Constitution, it was developed outside of government, specifically that we could bring a neutral view to how the whole system should operate. Because this system is designed to be combative. It's designed for differing views to compete to win our approval. It also means that the government has avoided all the difficult parts of this decision and basically said, oh look, it's all a bit too hard for you, the Australian public, to make an informed decision about, so let us worry about the detail, right? The detail can be who can be a member of this voice to Parliament. At the moment, it doesn't even say they need to be indigenous. How will that voice to Parliament be resourced? In the draft new Aussie Constitution, it's specifically resourced on the same basis as the Senate, so that there's a benchmark set, so that the government of the day can't manipulate, withdraw resources or provide excessive resources. When you're talking about putting things in the Constitution, you are talking about very important decisions. And it's not good enough to just dumb it down for Australians because the government feels that Australians are apathetic or wouldn't understand the nuances. Okay? By all means, give us a simple question, but put behind that the sort of wording that should go into the Constitution and define how it will operate, this voice Parliament. We have in detail listed how the Senate operates, how senators are elected. We have detail on the House of Representatives and how those members are elected. This deserves no less consideration, or it will be manipulated by future governments and adjusted. One of the reasons that the Uluru Statement of the Heart calls for a voice to Parliament to be enshrined in the Constitution is so that future governments can't shut down that voice. Under this change, they absolutely could shut it down. It would have to exist because that's what the Constitution says, but you could take away its resources, its power, and as I said, could literally be two white fellas nominated by the Prime Minister. Who knows? This doesn't meet the needs of, or what the indigenous people are asking for, and I don't think it clearly explains to the Australian people what they're agreeing to, and that's a problem. The Prime Minister, talks about the fact that there'll be a lot of criticism for this approach and a lot of scaremongering. I don't want to be a scaremonger, but the reality is this doesn't cut the mustard. People who, and there will be Australians who don't believe there should be an Indigenous voice to Parliament. I've had that sort of feedback already around the new Aussie Constitution. The argument that they put to me very strongly is that all Australians should be treated equally, that currently Indigenous Australians have representation to Parliament through their local member in the same way that all Australians do, right? That's a valid argument. I would argue that we can afford to do this, that this is something we can do, we can choose to do, as a mark of respect, as a mark of reconciliation. But that doesn't invalidate that argument that's put by some, that this shouldn't be occurring. Now those people particularly are going to point out the fact that there are no rules around this. The rules are determined by the Parliament of the day. If the Parliament of the day is very left-wing, we could end up with anything. And equally, if it's very right-wing, we could end up with almost nothing as a result of this change to the Constitution. So I would say to the government, you need to flesh this out properly. Who will be in this voice to Parliament? How will they get there? What limits will be on their rights and responsibilities? How will they communicate with the Parliament? I mean, you could take the view that I will give them a PO box and they can send a letter to the Parliament and that can be their voice. Or you could take the view that all legislation before the Australian Parliament has to go first to this voice and they could potentially veto it. I mean, the Prime Minister says this isn't about veto, but the reality is there is nothing in this constitutional change that would stop a future government from giving a right of veto to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Nothing. And all this does is open up for those who don't agree with having an Indigenous voice. All it's doing is giving them ammunition to say, this is crazy. There are no rules here. What am I signing up for? Okay, so a very simple question, which we had, which is, do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? Sounds very straightforward, but unless it's backed up with proper detail, proper controls that are set down in the Constitution and approved by the Australian people, then it's a recipe for disaster. And if we take this same approach forward to making Australia a republic, suddenly we're giving the Parliament the power to determine how the country will operate and run. Do you think a Parliament in the future is going to give the President any powers? If it's going to be a President? So where do we get the checks and balances? The Parliament's going to take all the power, or it's going to take the lion's share if it's the one making the decision. This is why the new Aussie Constitution was drafted outside of government and outside of political parties. It has to be a bipartisan changes to the Constitution, and we need far more detail. Again, the new Aussie Constitution is a far more detailed document than even the current Constitution. And these things are necessary if we're to prevent future manipulation of the system. Anyway, I'm glad to see that the government's putting this referendum forward. I would respect whatever the vote of the Australian people is on this, but I really hope that it won't be the case of just adding 3 sentences to the Constitution. that there'll be some serious detail, and that serious detail will be made available to the Australian people when they answer that very simple question of, do we want an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament? Okay. The question can be simple as long as the detail of how the changes are going to be implemented in the Constitution are spelled out, and spelled out properly, and not just left to the Australian Parliament, a partisan environment. All right. Thanks for your time.